Add context path to Spring Boot application. Beginner intermediate level. URL configuration. In a Spring Boot application, by default, your app runs like this: http://8080. But in real-world applications, you often need a context path, such as http://8080/API, http://localhost.8080myapp. This is called the context path. It is useful for grouping APIs, versioning endpoints, hosting multiple apps on same server, reverse proxy setups. Understanding context path helps you manage URL structure and deployment. What is context path? The context path is the base URL prefix for all endpoints in your application. Simple definition: context path equals base path added before all API endpoints. Example: without context path, http://localhost.80/users. With context path, API, http://localhost.8080 API users. Why use context path? You use context path when you want all APIs under /API. You deploy multiple apps on same server. You version APIs /v1/v2 using gateway or reverse proxy. Example concept: base path means organize endpoints, default behavior. By default, context path equals 0, which means no prefix is applied. Ways to add context path: 1. Using application.properties. Configuration server.servlet.contextPath equals API. Result: http localhost.8080 API. 2. Using application.yml. Configuration server servlet context path. Example concept: YAML means structured configuration 3. Using command line example: java-jar myApp.jar-server.servlet.contextPath/API. Example concept: runtime override means no code change for. Using Java configuration example: import org.springframework.boot.webserver.webserver factory customizer, import org.springframework.stereotype.component. App component, public class context path config, implements web server factory customizer, configurable servlet web server factory. Override, public void customize, configurable servlet web server factory. Factory.set context path. Example concept: programmatic config means dynamic control. Example controller code: @REST controller, @request mapping, users, public class user controller. Get mapping, public string get users, return users list. Access URLs without context path: http://localhost.8080 users. With context path /API, http://localhost.8080 users. Context path versus controller path. Context path: server.servlet.contextPath equals API. Controller path: @request mapping, http://localhost API. Users equals API users. Example concept: context path plus controller path equals full endpoint URL. Use cases: API versioning, v1 users, v2 users, microservices, user service, order service, reverse proxy, Nginx, backend API. Example concept: context path means flexible deployment. Context path in production. In production environments, often set via environment variables, used with load balancers configured in deployment scripts. Example concept: same app means different paths per environment, changing context path dynamically. You can override it using command line environment variables. Example: export server_servlet context path /API. Important notes: 1. Leading/required, API check. API no. Affects all endpoints. Every endpoint will be prefixed. 3. Affects Swagger, API docs. You must access Swagger with context path. Example: API Swagger UI.html. Common mistakes: forgetting context path in URL leads to 404 errors. Wrong configuration key. Using server.contextpath. Old. Correct. Server.servlet.contextpath missing slash. Example concept. Wrong config means app not accessible. Advantages of context path. Advantages include better API organization, easier routing, supports multi-app hosting, clean URL structure. Example concept. Structured URL means better system design. Limitations. Challenges include forgetting prefix in requests, affects all endpoints globally, can cause confusion in front-end integration. Example concept. Global change means impacts entire app. Best practices. Use /API as standard prefix. Use versioning /v1. Document context path clearly. Configure per environment. Avoid hard-coding URLs. Example concept. Consistent path means maintainable APIs. Concepts learned. What context path is. How to configure it. How it affects URLs. Difference between context path and controller mapping. Real-world deployment usage. Simple definition. Context path in Spring Boot. A base URL prefix added to all endpoints of a Spring Boot application. Final summary. The context path in Spring Boot defines the base URL for your application. You can configure it using application.properties, application.yml, command line arguments, Java configuration. It helps organize APIs, support multiple deployments, and manage URL structures effectively. Understanding context path is essential for API design, deployment, and microservices architecture.